Hey guys, it's Lewis on the Gaming Rift here, and today I'm going to be bringing you my MCU films tier list. Every single film in the MCU ranked worst to best. So with that being said, I won't delay you any further, let's get right into it. Also guys, I will put the tier list in the description down below if you want to use this and, create your own tiers. I'd love to react to them someday. So with that being said, we have 7 tiers here. We have God tier, amazing, good, average, poor, and awful. For the films that really didn't meet my expectations in the slightest. Moving all the way up to God tier, where the films that are my favourites in the MCU. Sound good? Good. Let's get started. So with that being said though guys, let's get started with the film that started it all, Iron Man 1. And for me, this film goes in the amazing tier. I've always loved Iron Man 1. I think it's a phenomenal origin story for, Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal as Iron Man. There's not many things that I dislike within the film. Like I said, I think the film itself is fantastic. CGI, top notch. I mean, the Iron Man suits have never looked better, in my opinion. When, everything about the suits in this film is phenomenal. Soundtrack, amazing. Supporting cast, pretty good. I wish that Don Cheadle was War Machine in this film. I think it would have been way better. It's a shame he was recast, although the actor that we did have did an amazing job. Really, the only thing keeping it out of God tier is the pacing at times. I think the pacing is kind of a little bit inconsistent, where you have like Iron Man being all secure and then suddenly the world's flipped on his head again. I think it could have had a bit more build up, and the villain of Obadiah Stane was pretty good. He's by no means my favourite MCU villain, but he was pretty good, and this film is phenomenal and deserves the amazing tier. Next up, The Incredible Hulk, and honestly this is a pretty controversial film because a lot of people put it in awful, and obviously the Hulk fanboys put it in God tier. In all honesty, I don't think the film is as bad as people say it is, but in terms of being an MCU film, I think I'm going to put it in average. I think the film itself is very, very good, and it is incredibly underrated. The thing is, as an MCU film, obviously it did set up some things within the MCU. Set up Abomination, who'd return for She-Hulk. It set up General Ross, who would return in Civil War, Infinity War, that sort of stuff. And obviously it introduced the Incredible Hulk, which, the Avenger that we all know and love. And there are things that I legitimately enjoy about this film. The soundtrack, the action. In my opinion, the final battle in this film is just so good. It's just 10 minutes of CGI monsters beating the crap out of each other. However, I think that the film does have far too much. It has far too great of a pacing issue. Like Iron Man 1, its pacing was way better than The Incredible Hulk, and I think that even though you could potentially put it in the good tier, I think I'm going to keep it in average for now. Next up is Iron Man 2, and Iron Man 2 for me is, I think I'd probably put it above The Incredible Hulk, but it's still just kind of an average MCU film. I think that when you had such a good solo film in Iron Man 2 was just a big disappointment, as I felt as though, once again, the pacing in this film was just not that good. However, it did introduce quite a lot of things. It introduced Black Widow, obviously introduced Don Cheadle as War Machine, introduced War Machine, he finally got his time in the spotlight. But that being said, it had the style of the original film, but it lacked anything that made the original film good. After the Whiplash battle with the, suitcase armor on the racetrack, the film just slows down, and it brings us into the subplot of, the poisoning of Tony Stark from, the Palladium arc reactor. And, we spend a great portion of the film, he's trying to fix himself. I think that's fine enough as it is, but it really brings the film down. And it's such a shame because when everything comes to the conclusion in Iron Man 2, you've got the Mark 6 teaming up with War Machine to, stop Whiplash. I think that is an incredible final sequence, and the film definitely is visually beautiful, but it just has too many issues, and I wouldn't watch it if I had the choice. But when it comes to visually beautiful, we have the first Thor film, and I would put the first Thor film maybe... is it above? I think it's an average MCU film, but that being said, I do really like this film. Like, it's nowhere near as bad as people say it is, and again, I think Asgard looked so fucking beautiful in this film. Like, when you compare Ragnarok Asgard to the first Thor film's Asgard, it's no question, this film is beautiful. It also introduced, obviously the cosmology aspect to the MCU. It's not all earthbound threats, you have like the god pantheon. Chris Hemsworth's portrayal of Thor in this film was incredible as, like, you know, this arrogant son of a bitch turned into, you know, the fallen god of thunder, and then he finally has to, you know, learn humanity and become better and ultimately prove himself worthy to not only himself but to Jane Foster, to, you know, Odin, Heimdall, everyone. I think that the film's got very good action. The soundtrack, it could be better, it could be worse. When I think of great MCU soundtracks, I never think of Thor 2011. However, it is a good soundtrack in and of itself, it's just not very memorable. The final battle, again, pretty cool. Again, you could put these films in good, however, I'm keeping them here, as I don't think they quite hit the criteria when compared to future films that we've yet to get to. And we don't even have to wait that long for the good tier, because the first film to go into the good tier is Captain America: The First Avenger. I really like this film, you know, being the gritty World War II vibe. I really enjoyed it. The character of, you know, Chris Evans, Captain America, is likable. You know, he's this flawed, honest kid with a good heart. He becomes, you know, the super soldier with the, you know, the experiment gone right. And I think that everything about this guy's growth is incredible, where, you know, he attracts Peggy Carter, but then she kind of rejects him when she sees that he's becoming more of like a typical soldier, but then, he's still the good kid with a good heart. The soundtrack in this film is really good. I do like the gritty, you know, World War II vibe. It's definitely unique and helps it stand out. The villain of Red Skull was kind of generic. You know, obviously he was memorable. I'm not gonna deny that. However, I think that he was just the stereotypical German bad guy, or the stereotypical Nazi bad guy, I suppose. But with that being said, the film is still very good. Not as good as Iron Man, however, I think that it was a clear league above these three, and it really does deserve the spot in the good tier. Taking the first God tier spot, we have The First Avengers. I really, really like this film, and if I'm honest, if it wasn't for one other film that we will get to later, this would still be my favourite MCU film. Honestly, I loved everything about this film. In my opinion, the weakest aspect was just Captain America. I think that the Captain America in this film was pretty bland, pretty generic, a bit of a step back from, you know, his solo film. But other than that, everyone brought their A game. You know, Robert Downey Jr., phenomenal as Iron Man. The villain of Loki carried over from, you know, the first Thor film. I actually really liked Loki in The First Avengers, and I personally preferred him to his debut in Thor, because I like how, you know, Cap and Iron Man kind of beat him, quote unquote, early on in the film, and then he spends, you know, the second act basically messing with the Avengers behind the scenes. I think that was a really cool dynamic. The final battle in this film was absolutely incredible, you know, the Chitauri army. The soundtrack, amazing. Visuals, phenomenal. And I think that the Hulk in this film was portrayed damn near perfectly, where he's essentially this force of nature for both the villains and the heroes alike. And you see that in the film, you know, with the, you know, horror section where he's chasing Black Widow to the encounter with Thor. I think that this film was phenomenal. There's really not many bad things about it. I mean, yeah, I do have the rose-tinted glasses because obviously this was my first MCU film, but it has truly stood the test of time and it still deserves the God tier. Well deserved, and a great finale for Phase 1. Starting things off with Phase 2, we have Iron Man 3, if I can fucking find it. Where is it? There it is. I think Iron Man 3 is a film that not many people can agree on. Just like The Incredible Hulk, there's people that would put it in awful, some people would put it in amazing, and I've even seen a tier list which put it in the God tier, which I'm slightly confused about. They must have just come out of a coma or something. But in terms of how I like the film, I think, honestly, it is the worst of the Iron Man films. I don't think it's... I think for me, it would possibly go in poor. I think that it's a very controversial take. I just didn't like this film much in the slightest. Now, to get, you know, the obvious praises out of the way, Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. and Don Cheadle and the supporting cast all bring their A game. I think the acting in this film is very good for the most part, and I really like the Iron Legion, where, you know, he basically makes like 35 Iron Man suits off screen, leading to, you know, the Mark 42, which is more of a liability than it is an actual aid. I think I'd rather go into battle unarmed than with that piece of shit Iron Man suit. But with that being said, that is where, you know, the positives end for this film. I think the pacing was terrible. Well, you know, in Iron Man 2, at the very least, you know, He's trying to sort out the palladium for his heart. In this film, he's basically trying to get over PTSD from the first Avengers, but I just don't like how it was portrayed. I don't know what it is. It's not entertaining to watch, in my opinion. Maybe it's the fact that the film takes place in an entirely different location to the one that we were familiar with in the first two films. The villain in the Mandarin was so fucking terrible. Like, I did not like this guy in the slightest. He reminded me a lot of, Electro from The Amazing Spider-Man, just like this random nobody who just gains superpowers and suddenly, is fantasized with Iron Man. Kind of like Mysterio, I suppose, but like just way freaking worse. I didn't enjoy this film at all, and it's the first poor film in my opinion. However, Thor fans don't want to feel left out, as joining Iron Man 3 in the poor tier, we have Thor: The Dark World, and this is the worst MCU film so far on my list. I think that this film was just so freaking bland, everything about the first Thor film, it feels like was just taken a step back with Thor: The Dark World. Now, obviously, yeah, Chris Hemsworth, all those, the supporting characters, Loki, Odin, whoever, they're all really good in this film, I'm not denying that. However, that's kind of where the good things end, the action is stylish, but it's not the best that the MCU would have to offer. Visuals, okay. Soundtrack, not very memorable. But I think the biggest pain in the arse thing for me in this film is Christopher Eccleston as Malekith. Christopher Eccleston literally revived Doctor Who and is one of my favorite actors of all time. Yet you make him such a fucking forgettable villain, and it's such a shame. He's basically just like Ronan, just like this random dude who just wants to destroy shit. Not very memorable or likable. And for me, I just didn't like Jane Foster in this film either. I think it let down the film slightly. And to be honest, this film was just not very good in the slightest. I wouldn't even put it in average, just because at least these three films have like some memorable aspects that put them above. You could reorder these films, but in the grand scheme of things, this film just has fucking nothing going for it. I wouldn't quite put it in awful, because there's a few more films yet to come that I think deserve the awful category, but it is still a very bad MCU film. Now, this is an interesting one for me, because Captain America: The Winter Soldier is a film that I always see in people's God tiers. For me, personally, I don't think it quite meets the God tier, but I think it's better than the first Iron Man film. I think that this film made Captain America cool, where like, in the first Avenger, he was pretty good, but in the first Avengers, he was pretty bad, pretty underwhelming. This film, in my opinion, made Cap very cool. Like, any fistfight he's in, any interaction he has with Falcon or, Black Widow, he's just a cool, likable character that you always want to root for. The villain in The Winter Soldier was interesting, and it was one of the more heart-wrenching reveals, where obviously we saw Bucky die in the first Avengers, quote-unquote. The first Avenger, sorry. But obviously in Winter Soldier it was revealed that he was, brainwashed by Hydra. He became the titular Winter Soldier. The action in this film was amazing. I like how it was more grounded. Obviously we had obviously we had like alien invasions in the first Avengers, but in this it was more grounded to an extent. Although I did like, the Hydra reveal, where Hydra's basically infiltrated the government, really brings a nice tie back to the first Avenger. This film for me is amazing. I love most things about it, but I think it's just not one of my favorites, and I wouldn't quite put it in the God tier. The final film for 2014, we had Guardians of the Galaxy, and I would probably put this in God tier. I really enjoyed this film, how it was a complete, interstellar adventure. It introduced the 5 original Guardians as well as Nebula, and all of the Guardians in this film were likable to some extent. I think my least favorite was probably Star-Lord, just because I didn't gravitate to him as much as the others. But like, Gamora was very interesting, Drax was funny as fuck, same with Groot. Rocket, was very funny, very likable. All these characters were amazing. The one thing that really holds it back, though, is again the villain. I know that Thanos had some screen time in this film, but realistically it was Ronan that was the main villain, and he was just so one-dimensional that it kind of hurts the film. Not to mention, I just didn't quite gravitate to the Guardians as much as I like the Avengers. But regardless, pretty much everything about this film is amazing. Pacing, fine, you know, soundtrack, phenomenal. Same with visuals, I really liked most things about this film, and it's an easy God tier for me. Avengers Age of Ultron is a film that I think a lot of people really overhate. I honestly really like this film, however, I'm going to put it in the back half of amazing, because I feel like everything that made this film good, the first Avengers did better, where like halfway through the film, you know, the team is split up, and then by the end, they're all back together. I think that the way Age of Ultron did it was pretty good, and I really liked the characters that it introduced, you know, introduced Scarlet Witch, introduced Quicksilver, even if they killed him off, and obviously they introduced Ultron, was a very interesting villain. He wasn't the most powerful or the most likable, but I think that, you know, the whole idea that, like, I don't really know how to explain it, like, it's kind of like if Iron Man 3, you know, Tony made the Iron Legion, but they turned against him. That's kind of how I feel like with Ultron. And I really did enjoy, you know, his creepy, sinister voice and, you know, his creepy performance. I did really enjoy that. The action, again, I love it in this film, whether it's the attack on the Hydra base, the final battle, or obviously, you know, the fight between Hulk and the Hulkbuster. There is a lot of things to like about Age of Ultron. However, I do think that it's kind of like Spider-Man 3, where I like all the individual aspects, but when it comes together as a film, it's not quite as good as the first Avengers, but it's an easy, amazing tier film, and I think that it gets far too much hate. Next up, Ant-Man, and this is a very, very likable film, and I think it deserves the good tier. I think that this film is very, very fun, you know, whether it's Paul Rudd's Ant-Man or all the supporting characters. This film was funny as fuck when I first watched it, you know, whether it's the learning his powers montage or whatever. I think that it was very interesting to see, you know, Scott's, you know, journey from, you know, this random crook to, you know, a superhero and eventually Avenger. I think that this film really did owe itself to, you know, Paul Rudd's amazing performance. I think that most things about this film were great. You know, the soundtrack was kind of underrated, the visuals pretty good, but realistically, it is just a discount Iron Man 1. Like, pretty much everything about this film was kind of a rip-off. I don't want to say rip-off, but like more of it paid homage to the first Iron Man film, where, you know, obviously the villain was like this billionaire dude. He had the same powers as the hero, but like just better. I think that this film was a clear step back from the first Iron Man, but with that being said, it is a very, very likable film, and honestly, you should watch it if you just want to sit back, relax, and enjoy a really comedic film. Captain America Civil War is another god tier film, and I think I would put it behind the first Avengers, but it's an amazing film and really does deserve the god tier. I really like how it managed to balance how all of these different characters that have been established react to the Sokovia Accords, whilst also introducing new characters, most predominantly, obviously, with Spider-Man. You know, Tom Holland's introduction in the MCU. I think Tom Holland in this film was fine. He wasn't, you know, particularly spectacular, but he was a very good Spider-Man, and he was entertaining regardless. Pretty much everything about this film was good. Again, you know, it managed to juggle a huge cast of characters, but make them all, you know, likable, relatable. It introduced Black Panther as well, and I really liked, you know, Chadwick Boseman's portrayal of Black Panther in this film, where he's essentially trying to avenge his father. He, you know, I don't want to say he's consumed by vengeance, because he really isn't, but like, he basically is like this unrelenting force throughout the film. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's Winter Soldier or Captain America, he'll fight anyone to try and get, you know, to Bucky. I really like the villain of, you know, Zemo as well. I like the idea that, kind of like Loki in the first Avengers, he doesn't lay a hand on the Avengers, but he basically fucks with them behind the scenes, causes the Avengers to, you know, disband, and which would eventually lead to the events of Infinity War and Endgame. More predominantly Infinity War, because obviously Endgame everyone gets back together, but you know what I mean. Like, I think this villain was very interesting. He was likable. He was pretty down to earth. How basically he just lost his family in, you know, the events of Age of Ultron, became consumed by hate and wanted to get back at the heroes. I really do like this film. Pretty much everyone likes it. It's an easy god tier film. Doctor Strange is a very interesting film, and I would probably put it in the good tier. However, do I think it goes the best of good? I don't know. Where do I think it goes? I have literally no idea. I haven't seen this film in a long ass time, but again, I really like how it basically, again, it's kind of like the Iron Man thing where, you know, Stephen Strange is like this billionaire, or like this really fucking rich, you know, surgeon. He's extremely good at what he does, but then this twist of fate basically fucks his hands, and he has to go learn, you know, magics. He believes that, you know, the magic will heal his hands, but then it turns him into, you know, the Sorcerer Supreme almost, and, you know, he becomes part of the bigger picture. I do really like that, and I think Benedict Cumberbatch was like the best casting for Doctor Strange. Once again, I think the supporting cast was amazing, whether it's, you know, the Ancient One or especially Wong. I really liked him in this film. Everyone brings their A game. Soundtrack was amazing. Visuals were the biggest departure, I feel like. I feel like everything, especially with, you know, the mirror dimension, dark dimension, etc., took a massive leap in a direction that maybe not everyone enjoyed. I personally did like it. You know, I think that when you introduce magic into a world filled with technology and stuff, I think that it should be inherently contrasting in terms of visuals. The villains of Caecilius and Dormammu were definitely interesting. You know, Dormammu was like this, portrayed as like this all-powerful being. I know he's not all-powerful, just relax. And Caecilius was a very interesting adversary to, you know, both Strange and the Ancient One. I think that this film is good, but I don't think I'd put it any higher, as I feel like, again, it's just missing a little bit of, I don't even know what it's missing, but I think that's the perfect spot for it on the tier list, in my opinion. Oh dear, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. What do we do? I think that the first Guardians was amazing, but I don't know where I'd put this film. I don't think it's amazing by any means, but at the same time, do I really put it in average? I don't know. I think that this film was... where do I put it? Honestly, yeah, I think I'd put it in the top of average. I think that this film was just kind of lackluster. It wasn't, like, the best film ever. It was far from terrible, but I think that it wasn't good, really. It introduced Mantis and, you know, further developed the core Guardian characters, but in my opinion, it ruined my favorite Guardian at the time, which was Adult the Groot. You know, this dude was a badass, and they replaced him with Baby Groot, and while Baby Groot was certainly memeable, he wasn't that good in my opinion. You know, he wasn't all that entertaining to watch, a little bit cringe. The villain of Ego was interesting. I like the whole father-son dynamic, but realistically he wasn't much more than that. He was basically just this really powerful dude, and I think that Dormammu was more interesting than Ego, even though Ego had some you know, personal history with, you know, the main character of Star-Lord. I think that realistically it's just an average team-up film. There wasn't much about it I particularly enjoyed or disliked. I think it just goes in the top of average or like the bottom of good. Maybe I'd put it in the bottom of good, actually, but you know, it's not a very good team-up film and a massive disappointment compared to the first Guardians, in my opinion. Again, Spider-Man Homecoming is kind of like Ant-Man, I feel like, where it's just this fun, likable MCU film. It doesn't take itself particularly seriously, and it is kind of a standalone adventure, although obviously there is tie-ins to, you know, Iron Man and the rest of the Avengers. I think this film has kind of come around on me where, in terms of it being a Spider-Man film, I think it's pretty underwhelming. I would probably put it in, you know, average or whatever. But in terms of it being an MCU film and with it having connections to, you know, Civil War and things like that, I think I would probably put it at the top of good for now. I think that this film was very entertaining. You know, Tom Holland really does bring, you know, the youthful energy of a little fish in a big world, if you like. The villain of Vulture was not as good as people say he is, but with that being said, he was still quite interesting and down to earth, which is at the end of the day what Spider-Man represents. When you have like alien invasions, fucking, you know, extraterrestrial beings from other dimensions invading the Earth, when you have, you know, a down to earth character like Spider-Man, I think a down to earth villain works. You know, the soundtrack in this film, again, really good. The visuals, pretty good. Yeah, again, like, it's more down to earth, so obviously instead of, you know, big massive leviathans, you have Spider-Man, you know, fighting enemies on, you know, a ferry and having to, you know, stop the ferry from splitting in half, which is a very good scene. I do kind of like that it paid homage to Spider-Man 2, where, you know, he lost the suit and, you know, he basically had to develop his personal life, but then it was like, oh, he never really had the choice of giving up his powers. I do like that. Was it as good as Spider-Man 2? No. However, I did really like that to an extent, and it really solidified Tom Holland's Peter Parker into the MCU as being a fun, likable character who's definitely flawed, but I think his film, it was pretty good. Thor fucking Ragnarok. What do we do with you? I think it's in the amazing tier, but I'm kind of deciding where it goes in the amazing tier. I think that, do I put it above Age of Ultron? Do I? I don't know. I think I would put it above Age of Ultron, but I think it goes right there in the amazing tier. I think that this film was really good, and it was sort of like a standalone adventure, but also a team-up film, where obviously you had the four main characters team up at the end of the film. You had Thor going on this journey where he essentially loses Mjolnir, and it causes a massive fucking crisis with the dude, as he essentially, it becomes apparent that he's relied too much on the hammer, and, you know, Odin has to remind him that, you know, Mjolnir doesn't make him the god of thunder, he always was the god of thunder. Again, visually, just like the other Thor films, with the exception of maybe Dark World, this film is gorgeous, you know, whether it's Sakaar, Earth is kind of unsaturated a little bit, but, you know, Asgard, Sakaar looked really, really good. I liked the action in this film, whether it was Thor's multiple fights with Hela, or, you know, Thor versus Hulk, or, you know, the starship battle. I think that was very interesting, very visually appealing. The soundtrack in this film was very good, and I liked the more light-hearted tone, you know, with this film. You know, Thor was a bit more comedic. I think it worked. The film introduced, you know, characters like Valkyrie. She was okay, I guess. She wasn't the standout of the film for me, let's just put it that way, and she's not really my favourite character either. But I think that Thor Ragnarok was a very good film, and when you factor that this film chronologically takes place just before Infinity War, I think that it was a very good film with a more light-hearted tone, which was kind of like the calm before the storm. In my opinion, the most overrated film on this list is Black Panther. I think Black Panther for me is just the top of average. I didn't really enjoy the film much. I think that Chadwick Boseman's performance was way better in Civil War and Infinity War than his own standalone film. I get that that's a hot take, but I think that the fact that he's like the Black Panther and then, you know, he loses to Killmonger and, you know, Killmonger takes over, I think it just didn't really work for me. I think the villain of Killmonger was very good, and I'm very happy that after the disaster that was the 2015 Fantastic Four film, you know, the actor would be able to get a far more impressive role than, you know, the Human Torch in that film. He really did bring his A game, but I think for me, the biggest issue with this film was just the huge reliance on CGI, and this is a common problem with like the latter half of the MCU films, in my opinion, where the final battle of this film should have been really good, and it had the potential to be amazing. You know, when you had such good martial arts scenes in, you know, Captain America the Winter Soldier, as well as especially Civil War, this film was just two CGI dudes fighting in a CGI environment. Didn't look realistic or grounded in the slightest, and I think it made... I did enjoy Killmonger's, you know, sacrifice at the end of the film, but realistically, it just didn't... I didn't gravitate towards the characters much. I didn't really like Shuri either. I find that she was just a bit more annoying than anything else. And in my opinion, the best scene in the film was just the post-credit sequence where, you know, Winter Soldier gets his new vibranium arm after it was destroyed in Civil War. But apart from that, there wasn't too much about this film that I enjoyed, unfortunately. Simply put, Avengers Infinity War, in my opinion, is the best MCU film. I think that it perfectly culminates 10 years of MCU into the perfect film where they actually lose, which I think is very interesting. And if there was a villain to make the heroes lose, I'm very happy that it was Thanos. You know, I enjoyed Thanos so much in this film. He overtook Loki as being my favorite MCU villain, as a guy who believed so much in his, you know, beliefs and stuff that you could almost emphasize with him. You know, the fact that he basically breezed through most of the heroes in the film. You know, Hulk wasn't much of an issue to him. Iron Man, you know, couldn't defeat him. Doctor Strange couldn't. The only character who came close was Thor with Stormbreaker, but even then, he wasn't able to stop Thanos in the end. And I think the gut-wrenching impact that the snap had was one of the most, like, I don't think I'll ever forget my reaction. Just wide-eyed in the cinema, desperately hoping that my favorite characters wouldn't be killed. And, the death of, Spider-Man, Scarlet Witch and stuff, those characters, Black Panther, Winter Soldier, the characters that died due to the snap really were, it was an emotional moment for all of us. It was heart-wrenching. This film was just amazing. Visuals, it leaned more towards CGI, but at the very least, every location, with the exception of Earth, was beautiful. Whether it's Volmir, where you got the Soul Stone, the Statesman, or especially Titan or Wakanda. Visually, this film was amazing. Same with the soundtrack. And again, it's impressive that it managed to juggle a huge amount of characters, but did so in a really, really good way. And for me, this will always be the best MCU film, and I love it so, so much. Ant-Man and the Wasp. Oh dear. What are we saying with you? Okay, I think Ant-Man and the Wasp, fun story with this film. I actually watched this on a plane. It was the first MCU film in a while that I didn't get to see in cinemas. I actually watched this on a plane. I think this film, it was fun, but it wasn't as good as the first Ant-Man. I appreciated that they tried doing something different with, the villain of Ghost and stuff, giving Wasp more screen time, but I think the film goes right there. It was a very it was on the back half of the MCU films where, it explored more into the quantum realm, gave Wasp more screen time, and, they tried rescuing, Janet, Hank Pym's wife, who was believed lost in the quantum realm. Turned out she survived, and gave them all more screen time. I think those aspects of the film I enjoyed, as well as the consequences from Civil War. Scott was like electronically tagged. He was under house arrest, had to stay at home, and I think those aspects of the film were really good. The human elements, but the action in this film was not very good. It was just a bit of a step back from the Ant-Man film. And the one thing that I do really like about this film is, the ending scene, or the post-credit scene, I can't remember, where, Scott's essentially trapped in the quantum realm because, those three fuckers were unfortunate enough to all get dusted by the snap. And it really does tie into the start of Endgame. And I did like this film. It's fun enough for what it is. But in terms of being a good MCU film, it's unfortunately towards the back end. Sorry, Ant-Man, but it is what it is. Captain Marvel for me is the first awful film. I didn't enjoy this film in the slightest. There wasn't much about the film I enjoyed. The character of Carol Danvers was just so fucking bland, forgettable. I just didn't enjoy her at all. I didn't like the villains either. The villains weren't that good. Visually, the film was alright, I suppose. I mean, there were more better, flashy MCU films like, Doctor Strange, Guardians. Soundtrack wasn't very good in the slightest. There just wasn't anything about this film. This film is just, I think Homelander summed it up best. You're not even pathetic, Captain Marvel. You're just nothing. So we go from one of the worst MCU films to one of the best with Avengers Endgame. I think Endgame is a bit overrated, but that being said, I do think it is phenomenal. And for me, I think it goes right there. I don't think it's better than Infinity War, and obviously I am biased towards the first Avengers, but there's no denying the monumental task that Endgame had. It had to conclude, Iron Man's journey, Captain America's journey. You had like half the characters that were dusted, so it managed to spend more time with the characters who weren't dusted, the core 6 Avengers, as well as the remaining, Guardians, stuff like that. I think that it did a decent job, but the biggest issue with the film for me was just the time jump. With the off-screen development, I didn't enjoy that much, and I think that far too much happens in the 5-year time jump. I'm aware that 5 years is a shit ton of time, but realistically, I think we should have been shown much, and they could have done, like, a Deathly Hallows Part 1 and 2, which I suppose Endgame and Infinity War were kind of two halves of the same film to an extent, but I think that just so much shit happens in the time jump that it kind of makes me a bit disconnected. But with that being said, even that isn't enough to ruin what is such a great film. The visuals were kind of lackluster once again, the Earth visuals, but when it came to the portal scene and any scene that was not on Earth was just fantastic. The soundtrack is possibly one of my favorite MCU soundtracks of all time. The villain in Thanos wasn't as good as Infinity War, but it was still Thanos, the guy we all know and love. Endgame was just phenomenal. It made us laugh, it made us cry, it made us cheer. It was just an experience I'll never forget, and it deserves the God tier. However, we are nearly at the end of Phase 3, and we have Spider-Man Far From Home. Oh dear, I did not like Spider-Man. I think Spider-Man Far From Home is like the top of poor. I just didn't enjoy this film much at all. It takes place right after Avengers Endgame, but it kind of took everything that made Endgame good and turned it into a joke where, this universe-altering event with, the snap and, the blip, if you like. All these characters were, it should have been a darker film than what it actually was, but it was really light-hearted in tone, which I just didn't think worked at all. Now, yes, the light-hearted tone worked in Spider-Man Homecoming, but I think that it just didn't work that well in Far From Home. And when you factor in that Thanos, Spider-Man fought against in, Infinity War and Endgame, I think Spider-Man should have been far more mature in this film than he actually was. I mean, he made so many fucking dumb decisions that made it hard to relate to him. Like when he gave, Edith to fucking Mysterio, the only thing that he got from Tony Stark's passing, and he immediately gives it to just this random twat. I really hate the fact that Peter goes through so much, a loss of confidence in this film, like whether he should be the next Iron Man or not. I didn't enjoy it in the slightest. The villain of Mysterio, again, he was okay, he was entertaining, but I hated that, it came back to Iron Man. He didn't, have much of a connection to Peter until Peter actually started fighting him. The final battle, not that memorable either. I did enjoy the fact that, I did enjoy the Spider-Sense scenes in this film. I think they were interesting, but I hated that they had to nerf Spider-Man in order to make, the Spider-Sense worth it. The soundtrack, again, was pretty good. The visuals, meh. The characters in this film were fucking annoying. Realistically, it's a poor Spider-Man film. I get that that's a hot take, but it is what it is. This film just wasn't for me. So we finally arrived at Phase 4, and I'll be honest, there weren't that many films in Phase 4 that I enjoyed, but we'll get through the ones that I did enjoy first. Those being Spider-Man No Way Home and Shang-Chi. Shang-Chi, for me, I'm going to put it in the bottom of good. I think this film was genuinely a breath of fresh air. This martial artist dude, I really liked, the fight on the bus. The scenes with Wong and the Abomination was a nice callback to the Incredible Hulk. It was a breath of fresh air. I would put it above all of these, but I think that by the time it gets to the final act, it started to lose me a little bit, and it just wasn't that memorable of a film, in my opinion, which is why I put it in the good. Now, Spider-Man No Way Home, we'll just cover this one quickly. I really liked No Way Home. However, as an MCU, I think it was a really good Spider-Man film. But as an MCU film, I think I'd probably put it in the amazing category, right behind Winter Soldier. Or maybe I'd put it above Winter Soldier, I don't know. I really enjoyed that it paid homage to basically everything that made Spider-Man good in the last 20 or so years. The villains were incredible, same with the Spider-Men. Ned and MJ were very good in this film. Soundtrack, phenomenal. Visuals, pretty good as well. A definite improvement from, other films we've talked about. However, the biggest thing that killed this, the biggest issue I have with this film is the plot. The plot is just all over the place, and it really was unrealistic. Whether it's, Ned suddenly being able to cast magic, to, Peter winning a fight against Doctor fucking Strange of all characters, to the fact that Peter made so many dumb decisions as well. Like, he didn't even try going to the college administrator to sort out his problems. He was just like, right, can't go to college, let's just immediately go to, Doctor Strange, which I didn't enjoy all that much. I think that this film made quite a few changes in the right direction for Peter's character, but again, you know, he still made some dumb decisions which made it hard to relate to him at times. But I did really enjoy the ending, how he essentially cuts himself away from the world, and you know, he makes the tough choice at the end of the film, which I did really enjoy. So this film for me, probably the best Phase 4 film so far. However, we have these two films as well. Black Widow, awful, and Eternals is... Where the fuck does Eternals go? I think I'd probably put Eternals in like the bottom of poor. So going over Black Widow first, like, I don't hate Black Widow. I think that she was one of my favorite characters, but this film does not do anything good for her in the slightest. It should have come out a few years earlier, like maybe directly after Civil War, or maybe even before Civil War. But I think that, like, they killed her off in Endgame, and then they gave her her own solo film afterwards. I just didn't enjoy that concept in the slightest. There wasn't much about this film I enjoyed. CGI was awful, villain not very memorable, and it was just not very good overall. And Eternals, again, I appreciate the team-up film. However, aside from Icarus, there really wasn't any of the Eternals that I actually liked. Maybe Athena I did enjoy to an extent. I liked that it, you know, offered more like cosmology in the MCU, like with the Celestials and with fuck, I can't remember his name. The fucking Celestial, the Judge. Like, that's how not memorable this film is. I can't remember any of the shit from it. It just wasn't all that interesting. The only thing I remember from this film is just the fucking Harry Styles, you know, post-credit scene. That's all I remember from this film. And that should stand to testament as to how not good it is, in my opinion. Unfortunately, we don't have Multiverse of Madness or Love and Thunder on this tier list, so I'm just gonna have to like throw them in. Pretend that this is Love and Thunder. I'd probably put Love and Thunder like above the Dark World, but like still like in the poor category. I'd probably put it there. Love and Thunder was just a shit version of Ragnarok in pretty much all aspects. Nothing really more to talk about there. And then, say for example, Multiverse of Madness, it would probably go like, fuck, where would it go? It would go in the average tier, but maybe at the bottom of average. I just didn't enjoy much about this film. The only thing I enjoyed was Scarlet Witch, but that's not because she was written well, it's just because she was hilariously overpowered and just killed everyone she came across, which I found quite funny, but not for the right reasons. Doctor Strange wasn't very memorable in this film. CGI was pretty shit, you know. It introduced the Illuminati just to kill them off. There wasn't much about this film that I enjoyed, it was just kind of meh. And that's all I have to say about that film, really. It just wasn't, it was a massive disappointment, especially since Sam Raimi was directing it. But it just wasn't very good in my opinion, and it would be in the average, or maybe even poor films. But with that being said though guys, that was my tier list on the MCU films. Feel free to disagree in the comment section, I know you probably will. If you want to make your own tier list with this template, I will link it in the description. You can, you know, create your own tier list, send it to me and maybe I'll react to some of them. With that being said though guys, that's all I have for you today. So feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Turn on notifications to gain an inch, and have a good day. So this has been Lewis on the Gaming Rift, and I'll see you all in the next one.